So now we have looked at the 3D window, the 2D window, how to navigate within the different tabs and tools that Flow 3D provides. We have also been able to add an avatar, to move the patterns around, and learned about the gizmo to try out the simulation. The next step would be of then to try to make a garment. Well, in order to do that, there are some basic steps that you should know. First of all, before I mentioned that you could go on the right side, but on the left from the 2D window toolbar, and you could select to add a basic shape within your program in order to get started. So if I would click on rectangle, I could do two things. I could click once and I can add the measurements that I want and also the amount of repetitions I want from that shape. I could also, similar to other digital software, click once in the 2D window and drag, and then I'm able to specify the size through drag and drop. So I repeat, if you want to add a shape within the 2D pattern window, you could select the shape from the fourth option down. Once you selected the shape that you want, you can click once in the 2D window. This makes it possible for you to decide the measurements of the shape. You can also choose the angle of the shape. And lastly but not least, if the shape should be repeated. Secondly, if you would like to do it through drag and drop, that's also possible. You click once, keep left click pressed, drag, and then you're able to make the shape. Additionally, it is also possible to select a shape through the selection tool and move it around. Please be aware that that does not change the position of the shape in the 3D window. Maybe you decided that these are not the right measurements which you wanted, then you can select the second tool, which is the Edit Pattern tool. Now I can select a line individually, right click, and for example, choose to change the length. Additionally, I could also choose to do an offset internal line, which means that it makes it possible for me to draw internal lines based on the outer lines of my pattern. Here on the top right, you see that I can select how many lines I would like, but now you don't see it that much. Let me increase the distance between the lines maybe, and I will say 20, and then you see that I have 12 lines with a distance of 20 millimeters between them. Okay, I'm gonna cancel this for now. I'm gonna select the box because I don't want it, and then I can either do backspace or right click delete. The internal lines are very functional because you can split a pattern, you can create seams between patterns, but it also makes it possible to, for example, add an internal line by selecting the Edit Pattern tool, select, right click, offset as internal line, and then I will make the offset a bit more obvious. Click OK, click OK again, zoom in a bit. Now what I could do, for example, is to select this line, right click and cut, and now I have two patterns. But I could also select the line, right click, offset as internal line or even as internal shape, and then I'm gonna make a bit bigger so the difference is very obvious. And then I could select all the red lines, and I can do that by holding Shift and selecting the lines. I can right click and I could choose again to cut it. So this means if I cut, now I have two pieces. But I could also choose to go a step back and right click and do cut and sew. Now that I've done cut and sew, I still have two pieces, but if you would look in the 3D window and I move the pattern forward, you see these lines. These lines indicate that this pattern piece has been stitched. So that means, for example, if I would click simulation, and this one is frozen, the inside one is not frozen, and I would click simulation, the pattern would still be there. It is not dropping because I've sewn it to the other piece. Additionally, on this side, this pattern piece is not sewn, so if I would right click and unfreeze it, it would drop. So to repeat, you can use an internal line to separate a pattern. You can use the internal line to separate but also sew it together. But you can also click on the internal line. If I come If I would make another internal line here, you have the internal line tool as well. This means that you don't always need to right click. You can also go directly to the internal line tool, and I could, for example, decide that I would want a polygon, an ellipse, select, and now I have the line. I could go back to edit pattern, select the polygon. I could right click and I could copy, or I could clone as a pattern with sewing. So if I would clone as a pattern with sewing, means that now I do not have a hole, if you look in the 3D window, but instead I am now able to attach this pattern piece to the internal line. If I click on the pattern selection tool again, click on the lower box, I'm gonna click F for focus. In the 3D window, I'm gonna right click for reset to the arrangement, and I'm going to create an internal line, which can also be done, as I mentioned, with the base polygon, and I could select the one line where it should start and double click on the other and enter. Sorry, then if I want, I can also select the internal polygon line, and I click from one side to the other, double click. Now I have an internal line. I can go to the edit pattern tool, right click, cut, and this time I want to sew it with the sewing tool. So I will go to the selection tool, move this one a little bit down, and the first tool that you have for sewing is the segment sewing. The segment sewing takes one pattern piece with a second pattern piece of the same measurement and stitches them together. So now you see I click on the first line, I double click on the second line, and now this piece is stitched. It is important though that going back, you cannot start sewing one pattern from one side, sewing a pattern from one side and the other from the other side, because as you can see, it will cross my stitches. In case this ever happens, it's not a big issue. All you can do is right click with the edit sewing tool, which is the top tool. You select the line, you right click, and then you can say reverse sewing. If by any chance the sewing is not at all what you needed, you can also always select right click, delete sewing, or you can select to backspace to delete your sewing. So that was with the segment sewing. When you have doubts about how to use the sewing tools, you can always hover over them and then it will show you the manual and the video. You also have the option to use MN segment sewing, but this you would use if you would have one side of the pattern that is not equal to the other when it comes to the amount of sections. So for this one, I want to use the segment sewing. Then I would select the first line and press enter. I will select the first part of the second line and make sure that I am also able to select the second part. Now it is gonna ignore that there is a dot, a point that is disturbing the sewing. So it will still see it as 1 on 1. And if I click enter, the pattern has been sewn. Sometimes it is a bit more complicated and you have an uneven pattern piece or you have an even amount of points. For this, we always recommend to use the free sewing tool. That's how we get started with cut and sew, internal lines, and adapting the pattern pieces.